Victor Perton here for the Centre for Optimism, and it is my great pleasure today to welcome Fred Luskin. One of our members attended a lecture by Fred earlier in the year and just came away impassioned. That's Bill Gormley. And Fred is the director of the Stanford University Forgiveness Projects and the Associate Professor at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. And he also serves as the co-chair of the Gardeners of Forgiveness Project at Ground Zero in Manhattan. And one of the things we always do in these optimism cafes, Fred, is to ask each of the panelists what makes you optimistic. So what makes you optimistic, Fred?
I would say that my understanding of optimism, it's an internal state. And it's not necessarily dependent or even recognizing certain kinds of external realities. It's kind of an internal decision framework to see some hopefulness, but it probably has more to do with my inner values, goals, willingness than it does to anything necessarily that's going on outside. So when you say what makes me optimistic, it's my stance. It's how I make meaning out of things, that there has to be some positive purpose for what the hell we're doing here on this planet.
Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Noirin, what makes you optimistic?
Fred, I love that. You know what? The takeaway I took from that was hope and belief. Hope and belief. You know, that was the summary message from your lovely take on optimism. Thank you. For me, you know what it is? Some days it's very micro. So today's a little bit micro for me. I've been out for a gorgeous walk. It's the first day of lockdown in Melbourne. You know, so it's kind of, it could be a bit oppressive, but for me, it's been a gorgeous day here. I'm able to do what I'm able to do, and I'm really, really grateful and happy for that. And I had a gorgeous walk. I even had takeaway coffee. I think there's hope. There's hope, and I'm moving forward. So I feel good today.
Fantastic. And Robert, what makes you optimistic?
Well, as Noirin said, it is a beautiful day down here, so that transforms people into a great position as far as optimism is concerned. But also, I'm a golfer, so you have to be optimistic to play golf. So it's the only way to face life. So, but overall, I think people should have as an underlying, as Fred said, value of optimism. And I think if you can live to your values, you'll have a better life through it.
Fantastic. And our attendees are everywhere from Denver to Denmark again. So if any of you want to ask questions, Rob and Noirin and I are going to ask some questions of Fred. But if others of you have questions, as you know, we tend to then lift you onto the panel so you can ask your questions directly. So Fred, can you tell me about your work on forgiveness? How did you start in this area of global expertise?
I certainly didn't start with any expertise. I guess if I'm responding to your first question as well, it was some optimistic belief that people can be taught to not be quite so hate-filled, vicious, hostile, victim-filled, and orient themselves a little more kindly to what their life experiences had been. I mean, it was a kind of hopeful thing, but it meant that they would have to change and do something. It wasn't a kind of kumbaya optimism. It was that you can create education and conditions where people can give, I'm going to say, more skillful, kind-hearted responses. What led to that was a couple of things. One, I had recovered from my own significant mistreatment by people, and through that had shown myself that I don't have to be such a, I'm going to say, a hostile asshole all the time. You know, I can be like a nice human being, even though people weren't always so nice. And second, I had a long-standing meditation practice. And that, so when I was getting my PhD at Stanford, I wanted to do some psycho-spiritual training thing that was useful, and forgiveness just fit in the sense of back in the 90s, there weren't that many choices. So nobody was talking about research on love or compassion or kindness or anything. So I couldn't invent a field. And I think there were 2 or 3 studies prior to mine in the science world on forgiveness. So that had a lot to do with me doing a dissertation study, because I couldn't do one on a field where there was nothing that predated me. That's about the best answer I can give you.
And what are you've worked in Northern Ireland, you've worked globally in a number of the hotspots. What are the forgiveness projects you're working on now?
I'm still doing some work with people in Colombia as a response to the civil war that they had for 30, 40 years. About 1.5 years ago, give or take, we went there and helped them set up a National Museum exhibit on forgiveness, and I trained some trainers to go around the country and teach. Maybe, I don't know, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, I was there again, maybe not even that long ago, where I helped them create a series of training videos in Spanish on forgiveness, and I've done talks nationally to different audiences in Bogota. I've been involved in a long project with the state government of Hawaii, the island, to seed forgiveness throughout their islands. They have a long indigenous population that really practice this stuff, but they're hoping for a more scientific kind of basis than just indigenous practices. So they hire us rather than using just the more native practices. Those are probably the 2 international ones. You know, I do talks and stuff where I remind people, literally, just because like the world has been crappy to you, you don't have to be crappy back.
So I watched a video that Bill Gormley was inspired by as one of the alumni, your speech to the alumni, and you gave the example there of sending your students out on day 1 just for 10 minutes of enjoyment of the beauty of Stanford, rather than being attached to their mobile phones and the news streams. And I think you've got several steps that you recommend to people or habits in taking up forgiveness. So what are the habits that people should adopt in order to be forgiving and to take advantage of that wisdom you've developed?
I think the biggest part of it, and we hit a lot of resistance from therapists and many other organized groups when we started teaching forgiveness. People have a lot of invested, maybe not consciously, in victimhood. And so what we redefined around the issue was that we accentuated that making a grievance against something is a present-centered experience. Like, you're doing it now, even though what you're doing it about might have happened 5 years ago or 3 years ago or 15 years ago. There's a way of thinking and emoting and relating to life's experiences that is a conscious process right now. And so we try to interdict that process, first by making it conscious, and secondly by reminding people that you have a choice. So the simplest choice is right this moment you can complain about something, or right this moment you can look out the window and say it's beautiful. But if you choose many of those moments to complain, then you're going to have a different experience than if you choose to use many of those moments to look out your window and say it's beautiful. That's just the basic substructure of how we look at things. I can tell you that there are, I would say, 4 very simple processes. One is moment to moment, not moment to moment, but just practice gratitude so that you put the crappy experiences of your life into proper context. I mean, you know, you can highlight anything. And so if you highlight what's terrible, that takes over your consciousness. So practice gratitude, 1. Calm yourself down when you're upset rather than just blaming. 3, change your story so that you don't constantly create a victim state in your mind, a more empowered story. And 4, practice some eminently simple, like CBT practice, where you simply remind yourself that 1, you're not the center of the universe, and 2, the universe goes on fine whether you like it or not. So you might as well practice actively creating more acceptance. So those 4 very simple habits, if you practice those, you become more likely to forgive.
That's absolutely brilliant. Noirin, I think you wanted to ask Fred a question.
So we're looking at the habits of an optimist at the moment as a course, right? And you've inspired us to add optimism and forgiveness as one of the aspects of our course. So thank you for the 4 tips around learning to forgive, but what is your link or your take on optimism and forgiveness?
On what and forgiveness?
Optimism and forgiveness.
I mean, I can't tell you that I can, you know, perfectly align them. I think it would be almost impossible to be optimistic if you were constantly burdened by your past prejudices. I think that it would limit your ability to see your capacity to move ahead and make productive change because you'd be too busy fighting the issues of the past. So whether it's explicit or implicit, I think forgiveness is one of the essential kind of foundational things that one would either allow people to be optimistic or probably more problematic would be one of the big reasons why they're not optimistic is because they're too busy relitigating in their mind endlessly the things that went wrong. So that would be my, like, just thinking about it now kind of thing.
No, thank you. I had a second kind of question around when you forgive and there's a person involved, do you have to forgive the person or do you have to frame it differently in your head? Because if someone's done the wrong thing, they've done the wrong thing. So how do you forgive when there's a person involved?
I mean, the very definition of forgiveness is that it's done right now. So right now, you can clear the slate towards anything. Whether it happened 10 years ago or 10 minutes ago or 10 seconds ago, you can clear the slate. It doesn't matter if somebody knows you cleared the slate. It doesn't matter if they're dead. It doesn't matter if they like you. It doesn't matter what they did. It's your slate. So most people have no conception of the slate is only inside of them. There's no objective, well, this situation is so bad, so they should rot in hell for 5 years, but that situation only has them rot in purgatory for 2 years, you know, stuff like that. It's my slate.
Okay.
And the slate gets wiped clean when I die. So I decide how long I want to keep a dirty slate. It has really not that much to do with the past, except in our system of metrics around the past. That
very similar to what the Dalai Lama says about happiness at work. He says, you know, no one else has got an interest in you making your work happy or you making your work great. Only you can do it. It's exactly this word you use. It's your slate. Rob, I think you had some questions for Fred.
well,
Yes,
I
I did.
remember
Sorry.
when we first started decades ago, the Dalai Lama's statement on, you know, if you want to be happy, you have to practice the conditions that lead to happiness. So it was very clear to me that grievance holding was one of the really strong conditions of unhappiness. And so at its foundation, most of us, we are willing to sacrifice pieces of our happiness to hold on to our grudges. Like we make little deals with ourselves. So I'm not going to forgive my mother-in-law. Okay, so I'm willing to sacrifice 5% of my happiness for that because she was such an awful mother-in-law. Maybe I won't forgive something else and that one's worth 8% of my happiness. But we're always doing that and blaming them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how I see it.
Well, my favorite quote, of course, is from the Dalai Lama, which says, choose happiness, choose optimism, it feels better.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, Rob had some questions for you around leadership and forgiveness. Rob?
Yes, Fred. I was interested in your work with the native populations and their loss of ancestral land. I don't know whether you're aware, but in Australia here, the Aboriginal population is recognised as the traditional owners of the land. But I would like to know what you have learned from the work that you have done in this area, and what do you think could be used to actually bring about greater forgiveness as to what has occurred in the past as far as native land and custodianship is concerned.
I mean, the really sad part is what you just described is true in large swatches of the world. You know, it's not located in Australia. So what do we do with human beings who, I'm going to say, steal things from other human beings or appropriate things that other human beings need? What do we do about all of us who take so many more resources than we need in an earth and, you know, don't share them? I mean, the list of ways that human beings are selfish and insensitive is staggering. And so it's a much broader question than just what does one aggrieved group do about their perceived oppressors or grievers. So from what I have seen, having gone to different places, it's a cost-benefit ratio. So there is something to be gained by having some low-level shared grievance that unites their particular tribe or group and identifies a common kind of problem or enemy, so they can at least set their vision on what they need remedied and what it might look like for them if it's remedied. When that gets amped up, it harms them. You know, so if it's at a low level, it's like, yeah, we're here all to get together to redress this wrong. But if it takes over too much of their consciousness or becomes too much of a story, then it starts limiting their lives, their happiness, the health of their children, the optimism needed to make positive change. And it cements them in a certain status of kind of helpless and I don't know what the word is. And so it's a fine line. It's a very fine line. I've done trainings in way northern Canada for groups of Native Canadians who had their children stolen from them by like ersatz Christians, is probably the best word that I can use, who wanted to raise these kids properly. And then so we went there for almost a week and worked with them on these like ideas. I've done talks for in South Dakota for Native Americans, and you know, it's a fine line because the elders of the tribes of the Native Americans, they saw the impact on their own children of bitterness. It didn't give them a good life, but they also knew they had to keep some story going around the grievance that motivated people, but that didn't like limit them too severely. So what I think is that somewhere in there needs to be a coherent story of what's been wrong with a very severe, optimistic description of what needs to go right and a whole host of self-regulation strategies so they don't like burn themselves, they don't burn out their own insides, and they don't lose the capacity to see the good in this world that still exists. That's about, I can't give you definitives. I don't, you know, I'm not on the front lines. I'm not a political scientist. I can just talk from having worked with families and groups of people who have had really horrible treatment.
We have said we're sorry for our past in the way we've treated the Aboriginal race and that. But do you think that is sufficient to ask today, or should there be a greater emphasis on forgiveness and, as you say, working towards other solutions?
Well, I do not believe that sorry is sufficient. It is, I mean, even the research on what makes a good apology, that one, it takes responsibility that the actions were from me, that you didn't cause them. Two, my actions hurt you, that I see that. Three, I will stop those actions, you know. And four, if I can, I'll make some amends. So a real apology is very different than a lot of what passes for apology. You know, a real apology is deep, and it really recognizes that my group or me have harmed you, independent of your actions. It's our bad, not yours at all. Then that's saying, you know, I'm sorry, and here's what I can do. Now that's so a deep apology is real, but it also doesn't excuse or limit the fact that people who have been harmed have to also engage in practices that heal themselves too. I mean, it's so complicated, but it's a real apology. You know, it's like what passes for an apology in the United States often, I'm sorry that you feel so bad, which is not an apology at all. It's I did bad. You feel bad because of my bad, no other reason. I'm deeply sorry. You know, like that's where it begins. Anyway, I'm probably talking too much.
No. I would like to just take it one step further on that, and I'll ask a double-barrel question of you. Do you see forgiveness as a weakness in leadership? And what is the message that you would give to leaders today as far as forgiveness is concerned to make it a better normal world?
I mean, I don't know if it was Desmond Tutu, but, either he or Gandhi, where only the strong can forgive. And it takes a lot of strength and power to own one's suffering and feel it and not want to demonize the cause of it forever. Like that's a very powerful position, but it don't come easy. It is a lot of work. The second piece is I think that self-forgiveness, or again, asking for forgiveness for what one has done wrong, is is not applied enough. So, like real self-forgiveness includes, again, an awareness that I or we harmed, a responsibility for that harm. It's not like, well, I didn't know what I was doing, which could be true, but it was also, I was ignorant and didn't try very hard to find out. I mean, there's responsibility, there's some amends, but only when that has been done, then you can let yourself off the hook. Like, none of us are limited by the worst things we've ever done. Otherwise, this is one like hell-bent world. If that's how everybody is defined, by just their worst parts of themselves. But it's gritty, hard work to take responsibility and want to participate in restitution or change or amends or whatever that takes.
Yes, I did some work in Rwanda not long after the genocide, and it was remarkable what they had learned from the South African experience in terms of forgiveness. And Rwanda is now one of the safest countries in Africa. It's a very interesting change. Fred, I'd like to introduce you to Sean Callahan. Sean runs a global company called anecdote.com and is a great storyteller.
Hello, Sean.
Hey, Fred. Lovely to meet you. That analogy you used of the clean slate was terrific, because I must admit I'm actually going through one of those situations where, forgiveness is required. But I was wondering whether, I know it's all about yourself, right? And you make the choices to whether to forgive someone, but does it help you from a psychological perspective to actually tell the person that you're aggrieved with that you've forgiven them?
Is there a question in that?
Well, I wondered if the question is, does it help? Does it help clean your slate? If you actually say it out loud, if you actually go to that person and say that you've forgiven them, or does it not matter?
It depends why you're doing it. So if you're doing it to virtue signal how wonderful you are, it probably doesn't help very much.
Yeah.
If you're doing it to let people know that you really see the harm you were doing or whatever, might be helpful. But it all depends on what the real purpose is.
Yeah.
I mean, forgiveness is not always an end to itself. It can be, if the purpose is reconciliation, then depends on what both parties need. If the purpose is, let's forgive but move on, then it can be very helpful. We need to sever this relationship because it doesn't work.
Yeah.
But let's forgive in all ways and, walk away and not say bad things about each other. It's like, but the virtue signaling part is probably useless or negative.
Yeah, I agree. Very good. Interesting.
Go ahead.
No, Fred, can I also, and we'll have to, I think while we've still got some time for conversation, we'll have to enlist Sean to your cause, Fred, because Sean is a great storyteller and teacher of storytelling. But Renee, you had a question about the physical benefits of forgiveness beyond mental well-being.
Yes, yeah, and great to meet you, Fred. I'd actually written about you. I'm writing The Gift of Forgiveness in a book I'm writing at the moment before I even knew this was going ahead. And an hour later, I saw this come up on your site, Victor. So, Fred, I love your work around, it doesn't mean justification or reconciliation to forgive. I had sort of two questions. One was around the physical effects of living a life where you're not forgiving others.
I mean, again, you have to be a little careful because all of us are living our lives without fully forgiving.
Yeah. Mm.
Because we all speak badly of people in our past or have grudges that we just kind of take as normal and are hard on ourselves. So we're all unforgiving to something, to some degree, or multiple things. The big issue is the forgiveness stuff, which becomes part of our story.
Yeah.
I had crappy parents, therefore I can't be expected to be a fully loving adult. Like, that's a very destructive story. Mm. Or my people were victimized in a way that we'll never recover from, or these are stories that preclude optimism, preclude a certain hope that things will get better. And those stories, unfortunately, they just harm our physical, emotional well-being, central because of Desmond Tutu's, without forgiveness, there is no future. Yeah. What that means is, as long as you're constantly relitigating the past, you continue to have the past. Yeah. And so what Desmond Tutu is saying is, we need to move ahead. We need to catch up to our own lives.
Yeah.
When we don't live in today or whatever the heck that is, it changes our perspectives. It changes our perspectives. That pessimism or defeat have physical impacts. There is stress all over the place from holding grudges that can't be remediated. Those all have physical consequences. I believe that long-term emotional wounds probably have similar impact on our nervous system as chronic pain, because after a while the pathways join together and create like an escalating cascade that simply feels normal. But it's an entire orientation of looking backward towards negative experiences that we are dragging into the present or future, that limit our present and future, so that we limit our happiness and limit whatever it is, the endorphins or the healed, physiology that would accompany kind of a happier, more positive way of being of things. So it's a systemic whole body thing when our stories are so oriented towards, this has really harmed me to the degree that I will not forgive them and I will not let this go. It's that which causes the problem, not just the experience.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you. And just, do you think it has to start with forgiving yourself? I've been interviewing a few people, and a lot of them with their own personal experiences have really been open, and especially in the corporate world, because not forgiving affects culture. But they've actually said to me, it has to start with you, even if you're not at fault. What do you think of that?
Again, help me understand what the specific question is.
Does forgiveness have to start with you internally?
When it's a self-forgiveness thing?
Or situations around you. I've interviewed a few people lately that have said to me, even if I'm not at fault, and it's someone at work, I've just done a case study, so someone in another team, and they're like, I started to actually internalize and blame myself and find things and awfulize, not a real word, things within me. I started to think it was my fault. So I had to forgive myself that it wasn't me, but it was them. Does that make sense?
I think so. It depends what the purpose is.
Yeah.
So if as you said, you caught an unforgiveness virus and you processed it and recognized that you had stuff that maybe you were responsible for or could have helped or whatever, and you forgave yourself, if your purpose was to become a kinder, more contributory human being, that's going to turn out to be good.
Yeah.
If you took in information about yourself and your goal was to find something else to beat yourself up on, that's not going to have positive impact on anybody.
Yeah.
So it's intention, it's why we're doing the processing that matters so much. Not necessarily, I mean, there's so much variance among people and so much difference in how they do things and stuff that it would be really hard to give a simple blanket answer.
Mm.
But if you create an intention that, like, I wanna be the best person I can in this world.
Yeah.
You'll use all sorts of strategies to get there, you know? But it's that intention that's so valuable.
Yeah, and the context. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome.
Fred, may I introduce you to Susan? Susan has a question around past hostilities as well. Susan?
So my question relates to the Black Lives Matter movement that we've got at the moment. And so we've built up enormous international momentum around this, and some incredible gains have been had. And I thought one of the great lines that came out of the US was that be grateful that they are after equality, not revenge. And what I was going to ask you, and in fact, particularly Fred, but also the other panelists, around not to trivialise it, but if you could bring through a rallying sort of tagline for BLM that keeps it as a movement that unites people and doesn't degenerate into divisiveness, what would it be?
You know, one of the challenges of being human, or many challenges, is we have all these things wired into us. So we have templates for revenge wired into our nervous system. We have templates for forgiveness wired into our nervous system. We have significant potential for anger and destruction. And we have huge potential for healing and other things. The question would be, like, what's skillful at a certain period of time, not necessarily global, simple answers. So I believe that revenge is wired into us because every now and then that's the best answer to certain human problems. Again, you know, with Gandhi's an eye for an eye, soon the whole human race is blind. There are significant limitations to revenge. But sometimes, like, thoughtfully applied, it's necessary. On the whole, again, human beings looking to extract punishment for what has happened to them tends more to just continue a cycle of punishment and grievance and punishment and grievance. But every now and then, it's probably the most skillful response. The question again is what do you want? And for each of us, are we in a place of relative thoughtfulness where we can trust ourselves to come up with the best answer? It's like, so if you're just around 10 people who are angry, you can probably guarantee you're not going to come up with the best answer. But if you're around 3 people who are angry and 3 people who are completely kumbaya and 3 people who are in the middle, then that diversity of responses may give you a really skillful response that includes some degree of anger and payback, but people have their cortexes left so they can examine the consequences of that and try to make a really thoughtful but self-helpful way of responding. But it's complex, and it requires us to have brains that aren't fried out from bitterness. That's the risk that we all have. And it doesn't have to be in these huge cultural issues. It can just be that, you get so used to demonizing your sister-in-law that you can no longer talk to her. It doesn't have to be huge. But every now and then you may have to say something harsh to your sister-in-law. So I can't give you an ABC answer, because there's a skillfulness inside and a willingness to hear diversity of views to come up with skillful solutions that makes one-size-fit-all things really challenging.
Susan, if I can pick up the question that you offered to all of us. One of the things we've been collecting, I have a Google alert for George Floyd and optimism, or George Floyd and optimistic. And what I'm picking up are people who are taking action. So coming out of the George Floyd movement, there are new people, new voices in politics. There's funds moving to colleges that have a significant, Black population. Obama's been very interesting on this, but what's more interesting than Obama are the new voices that are appearing in the United States, in Australia, and as Fred says, people who are not just driven by anger, but people who are prepared to take action. So you see the mayor of Atlanta, who was just a mayor, now becoming a national figure, and her herself catching COVID in recent days has been not just a national US story, but a worldwide story. So what comes out of the Black Lives Movement matter and the protests in Australia and the United States and extra is not so much the march, because the march is sort of like a sugar hit. I went marching, for Black Lives Matter. It's the people who are actually making a difference. And a friend of mine yesterday sent me a note he is now the new family counsellor in a regional Aboriginal movement. There's a guy who's really going to make Black Lives Matter, helping people to improve the lives of families and children. So for me, it's very much around the protests are important, but it's as Fred says, you need the angry people, but you also need the people who can sit back and say, yep, there's a problem, but I can do something about it. And that's the purest optimism, isn't it? Shit happens. Bad things happen to good people. There's not a silver lining in every dark cloud, but I can make a difference.
Well,
Fred, I'd like to introduce you to someone very special. Bobby Redman starred in a recent broadcast we did that resonated around the world. And Bobby, without embarrassing you, Bobby is a psychologist who suffers from dementia. And she has become a national and global spokesman for living life with dementia and being optimistic in your dementia. So she's a very special friend of ours and someone I admire greatly. But Bobby, you had a question in quite a different context.
Thanks, Victor. Yeah, Fred, I'm sort of going back to the individual perspective again, away from the sort of the masses, but I mean, we've touched on it, I think. Do you think that people are born with a forgiving nature? Do you believe it's innate, or do you believe that it is something, you know, whether we're forgiving or not, develops purely through experience, or whether there's a personality type or an innateness to it? Just, you know, based on experience, that there are people that seem to be unforgiving in all areas of their life and almost have to live as victims, where others, you know, seem to, right from the start as children, seem to have this understanding and forgiveness of other people or situations. And I'm really interested in, you know, you've obviously looked into it far more than my thinking about it, and I'm wondering what your perspective is on this.
Well, isn't there pretty clear research that, I mean, most everything about a human being is about 50% genetic at some point, and that there's some interaction between like genetic predispositions and then our life experiences. You know, one of the things that makes all of this complex is we are learning organisms. And so things happen to us, and then we teach ourselves using the stuff we're born with as the basis. But then we teach ourselves, well, what are my parents doing? What are my neighbors doing? What's my community doing? So then they become templates of action, but they're processed through our, you know, kind of innate tendencies. And then we practice in our own minds, some of it taken from our culture, some of it from just our home, some of it just our tendencies. And then what we practice then starts influencing our very perceptions of what's going on. So it's not like we're viewing an objective world out there of events and experiences. We're co-creating that world by our tendencies and our habits and even our biological stuff. So it's an interaction that is constantly occurring. The problem is, for all of us, we create habits that are based partly on what we start with and partly on what we've learned. And we tend not to easily reevaluate those habits even when they don't work. Mm-hmm. And so that's when human beings really get stuck and it becomes problematic. But to think that it's either or, that would be very challenging to defend, just from what I know.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
The cardinal sin of a compare on these things, muting yourself. Fred, we are so grateful for your time. What is the best way we can help you? What are the questions we can help you answer, or what are the ways we can help your fantastic work? Because as I said, you know, our members who've been in your physical presence come away entranced. I am uplifted by our conversation today. How can we best help you in your valuable global work?
Well, you know what's funny is I had arranged my first and only trip to Australia last year. And I was going to talk at some happiness conference, I think in Sydney. And I hurt my back. And there was no way in this God's earth I was going to spend 15 hours sitting on a plane each way to give like an hour talk. I don't care where it is. You know, it's like, but it just was very clear to me it was not worth it. But because of that, I've given a talk for the Stanford Alumni Association of Australia, and I've given a couple of talks. So I've met some nice people who live in Australia, and that's been lovely. You know, that's good in and of itself. You know, it's like just it's nice. It's nice to know, you know, good-hearted people all over this planet. So that would be my answer. At some point, I hope to come to Australia and talk, but it's becoming less and less desirable to sit in a plane for 15 hours than it even was last year. And I forced them to give me, I don't know if it was a business class seat, but at least Coach Plus, but 15 hours was daunting.
So we get used to it, Fred. There's 1 million Australians a year fly to LA out of a population of 25 million, and a big chunk of them go on to New York, which makes it a 22-hour flight, or Chicago and the like. So it's quite funny that there's, even though our population is 25 million and you're 330 million, there's 4 times more Australians go to America than vice versa.
Well, I grew up in New York, and I've lived in San Francisco for decades. And like, you know, I take that 5.5-hour flight as tolerable because, you know, I do it. But over the last few years, I've started doing more work in LA. And so now the trip to New York seems less appealing after getting on a plane for 50 minutes. That other 5 hours isn't quite as compelling. So, you know, it's what you get used to.
We're very used to traveling long distances.
So why don't you tell me what, I don't even know what your group is. You were very nice to contact me, and I agreed to talk, but I don't even know to whom I'm talking.
So it's the Centre for Optimism. We came into existence in August last year as a follow-up to the Australian Leadership Project. So we were bewildered by why Australians had become so negative around leadership. You know, people have always been mocking of political culture, you know, and to mock your prime minister or leader of the opposition or whatever. That's just good sport around the world. Doesn't matter whether you live in, you know, Australia or Armenia or America. But we have become very bleak around leadership at every level, institutions and the like. And so we interviewed 2,500 people on the qualities of Australian leadership. And what distinguishes Australian leaders is, and there's a global stereotype of this as well, is we're the most egalitarian leadership style in the world. You know, you talk to the cleaner the same way you talk to the chairman. The Prime Minister drives in the front seat of the car, not the back seat of the car. Self-effacing humour. Very much the culture is laughing at ourselves, telling jokes against ourselves, you know, which in some countries is seen as a weakness, but here it's a strength. And then the third one is no bullshit plain speaking, you know, which is sometimes mocked.
I like that.
Yeah. So if those are the 3 qualities of Australian leadership, there's millions of people like that. And that's why Australia's #1 on the United Nations Development Index, #1 on the OECD Good Life Index. 5 of our cities are in the top 15 on the Economist ranking of cities for livability. So I was still bewildered as to why people were so negative. And I got the opportunity to speak at the Global Integrity Summit in 2017. And after 3 days of misery, my speech was on the case for optimism. And it lifted the room. And Helen Clark, who was the former New Zealand Prime Minister, who was then the head of the UNDP, said, turn that into a book, Victor, and I will endorse it. And so the book was a book, and speaking and the like was very good. But in August, it became clear to us that we had to create a structure. And we've now got 2,500 members. Close to you, people like John Hagel, Stephen Pinker and the like have joined. So we've got 2,500 people in 52 countries. And you know, we're still 9 months old. We're just coming out of nappies and working out where to go next. But that's us.
And it does seem that from the stuff that if you just let me talk for like another 30 seconds around this, from what I have really conceptualized around forgiveness, it emerges from a very simple confluence of gratitude and compassion. And I would believe that this would be really helpful to the work you're thinking of, that at its most simple, gratitude simply allows you to see that there's good in the world, even though really awful things have also happened, that it's essential for seeing things clearly. And compassion is essential to recognize that no matter what suffering you have had, other people have had that same suffering throughout history, and that everybody suffers. And so those are simple foundational qualities that are much easier to teach to people. But only when people normalize that can they go to the higher order, much more complex, demanding, and maybe important quality of forgiveness. But without that foundational stuff of simple gratitude, like, you know, you're lucky to be here for the period of time that you're here, and there's a lot of beauty here. And in that beauty, life often sucks. But those are very basic mechanisms that, again, for leaders or whatever, because I do a little bit of work here on that, I think that like triangle of simple psychological skills would be very disseminable and useful.
We're quite simple, Fred. Some of our modifications in language are at the most basic. So in Australia, if you ask someone, how are you? It's very similar to the French. You get a not bad or not too bad. 65% of the time.
Oh, that's fair.
Well, I did 3 sessions in prison.
I love
with
that.
some of the toughest prisoners. And I got them to stop asking the question, how are you? And instead ask the warders, what's the best thing happening for you?
That's
It
fair.
was so profound that we ended up doing a half-day session for the senior management of prisons. So that we offer these little things. So our most basic product is we ask people, what makes you optimistic? And we've asked that of presidents and prime ministers. We've asked it of women digging ditches on a roadside in India. And you always get this uplift. There's a Japanese writer, Megumi Miki, who lives in Australia, who's written a book called Quietly Powerful. And when I asked her the question, what makes you optimistic, Megumi? She said, just in asking me the question, you have lifted me. So we are really about these minor changes. We say smile like an optimist. It's so easy to forget to smile. So just walking down the street and smiling at a stranger lifts people. You know, laugh like an optimist, we say. You know, tell jokes. Like, I mean, you epitomize that, Fred. You know, you're constantly smiling. These jokes.
Let me add 2 things to that, and then I do have to go. One is teaching people to recognize, like, not just what makes you optimistic, but to recognize what's already coming your way. Like that would be an essential thing, and some also understanding of the necessity of grit. That even though what makes you optimistic is true, there are plenty of realistic things that would make you not optimistic. And you need to have a way of holding that also. And that's what's so tricky. Anyway, I do have to go. Victor, I'd be happy to chat with you guys again. I've enjoyed, really, a nice bunch of folks. If you want to have another conversation, that would be great. if you wanted to put me on your list of members and send me stuff, feel free. I'd be happy to talk. I've enjoyed, it's a nice, open, kind-hearted group of folks. So I would appreciate that.
You are now a member, Fred, and if I can just get Robert just to say thank you on behalf of the Centre.
Yes, Victor, and Fred, thank you very much for your time. It's been a valuable session to all of us, and I think everyone's taken away a whole lot of new thoughts as far as forgiveness and attitudes.
And I'd be happy to have a further conversation. It's kind of fun. There's something really fun for me that you guys are halfway on the other side of the world. I just can't get past that. But you know.
Well,
Victor, thank you.
Great
Everyone, wave goodbye to Fred.
Thank you. Bye.
And I hope we chat again.
We promise to do that, Fred. We're all coming away inspired and warmed.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Fred. Thank you.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that effervescent conversation with Fred Luskin. We'd love you to get involved with the Centre for Optimism. Go to our website, centreforoptimism.com. Sign up as a member, or there's a free newsletter subscription as well. And share what makes you optimistic. Have a great day.